everybody and the female body, gender in research, especially in the field. We have 3 resource persons for this session. We have Dr. Kiran Asher, who is Professor, Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies at University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's grounded in 2 decades of field-based research in Latin America and South Asia, has diverse research interests, focusing on the gendered and race dimensions of social and environmental change in the Global South. Her publications include a monograph, Black and Green, Afro-Colombians, Development and Nature in the Pacific Lowlands. She's currently working on a theoretical and political critique of development theories and post-development proposals by drawing on feminist and Marxist approaches in a post-colonial frame. From 2002 to 2013, she was Associate Professor of International Development and Social Change at Clark University. From 2013 to 15, she worked as a senior scientist in the forest just give me
Center
a
for
moment.
International Forestry Research, which just got dismantled about 2 weeks ago.
I have written it down, I'm sorry, as the Center for International Forestry Research in Indonesia, and ma'am tells me that it just got dissolved. I hope that you'll be speaking to us about your experience in Indonesia in the session. We also have IIHS fellow and ethnographer, Dr. Tripta Chandola, who will be speaking from her experience of detailed fieldwork in Govindpuri in Delhi. With that, we have Cynthia Morinville, who is a PhD candidate at University of Toronto, who is working currently on circuits of electronic waste. I hand over the mic to our panelists.
Thanks, Vanshika. All right, Cynthia. You go. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask each other questions to sort of give you a sense of the context of what we want to talk about. And I'm going to jump in and say, it's not just female bodies, part of that everybody is literally everybody, right? And we want to talk about the politics of knowledge production in addition to the issue of a body in the field.
Yeah, so if we could start and maybe ask you both to reflect on how has your experience been in the field, or like how that has changed since your early days or your different kind of training, and we'll just kick off from there.
Sounds good. Sorry, I have a bad cold. That's why I think I sound like Billie Holiday, but I don't. So I'm a biologist, trained as a biologist, and then moved to social sciences, and now I do work in the humanities. And I actually did a lot of field work in India as an undergraduate. So when I think about bodies in the fields, it's not just a female body. Everybody moves as a gendered and race bodies in the field, and it changes over time, and how you are perceived and how you interact with folks, right? It's always a dialectic. So I'll say I'll give sort of a couple of anecdotes to sort of give you a sense of different moments as well as different, dimensions of moments. So for instance, as a 20-year-old going to study endangered black buck in Ahmednagar district in Maharashtra, when I went to the forest department to sort of go and do, I went to this little field site to do field work, they didn't know what to do with me. They took me to sort of the forest officer's wife to make sure that, it's like, and she checked with me, did my parents know that I was there? What was my caste background? Because the idea of a young woman, this is in the, mid-1980s, wandering around in the fields of Ahmednagar to go study black buck was, I don't know if it's unusual now, but that time it was incredibly unusual. So there was this notion of sort of like, what was I doing there? What was I wandering around for? So one moment. I'm going to fast forward to mid-1990s when I started doing fieldwork in Colombia in the Pacific Lowlands, this time not just on conservation, but on sort of how Black social movements were engaging with economic development and environmental changes that were coming as part of the new constitution in Colombia in the 1990s. And there, as an Indian who was doing work in Latin America, and I'm sort of skipping over how I got there, we can talk about that if it's important. In the 1990s, as the Black movement was sort of taking off the ground, they saw me as a representative of India as a non-aligned country. So the way I was doing fieldwork, or the reason I was able to do a lot of fieldwork in very, very rural areas as well as with Black movements had to do with the way my body was read as an Indian who was non-aligned and sort of, had arguably, and it turned out for real, sort of, solidarity with Black movements. Let's fast forward it now to, 10 years ago when I come back to India on a Fulbright, and this time I sort of decide to go to Bangalore, which I've never been. I come on a Fulbright. So I want to go to a different part of the country, and navigating the scientific community and the conservation community in Bangalore was incredibly complicated. Especially since, again, I'm told that sort of, I don't act like Dr. Asher. I wasn't walking around sort of saying I'm Dr. Asher who teaches at a university in the United States. But so navigating the scientific community to say I'm interested in how issues of science and social science and ethnicity and gender intersect with environment and development, which was sort of my Fulbright project, was very, very, very complicated. Again, my body was read in a particular kind of way. And this time the field is not actually the field. The field is the scientific community and the conservation community in Bangalore. So I want us to think about field in a very broad sense of the word as well, where it was, really kind of, it took a lot of all my chutzpah to kind of stay through the 2 months to be in Bangalore because it felt like an incredibly alienating space. And it had been a long time since I've been in a space where I didn't speak the language either. So once I moved from the university setting, when I went into the street, I don't speak any Kannadiga, and it was very, very odd to be in a space where I didn't speak the language. Last anecdote, and then I'd like to hear from Tripta. So I go back and do work in Colombia. I still do field work. I've been doing field work there since the 1990s. Now my body is read very, very differently. I work with communities. I sort of, again, work with communities not in the same way that I did 20 years ago, because now these folks are my friends, they're my allies. A lot of them have been displaced because of the massive violence in Colombia. But a lot of the activists now have been working very closely with academics in the United States. And as Preeti and I have been discussing over the last 2 years, there's this stream of thinking, a field of thought that's being developed called decolonialism, which is talking about sort of alternatives to, a different kind of society, a post-colonial society. So in this moment, as somebody who is from India, who's read as being from India, I'm associated with post-colonialism, which is misread as being after colonialism. So the same body, the same communities, 20 years later, there's a way in which I circulate in that space very, very, very differently. So even people who've known me for a long time and with whom I can sit down and have, what I call recreational arguments, when it comes to doing certain kind of work, I'm constantly read as being post-colonial. And so, so again, the body in the field is not just a female body, but it's erased and gendered and aged bodies, and its interpretation changes over time and very much changes also vis-a-vis geopolitics. It's a very different moment of geopolitics than it was 20 years ago. So I'll leave it there, and then we can have further conversations. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to what was being discussed. Like when I started going to the Govindpuri Juggi slums almost 15, 16 years back, I was 23 years old. I was young. And so like the body in the space, both in terms of the expansiveness of or the limit of where the field ends or begins, that kind of a thing. But also it's not just the gendered body. It's also the caste body, the class body, and how you're read. But having said that, and I was just telling it to Cynthia a moment earlier, that when I first started going into the Juggis, I was very performative. I was performing a kind of femininity which was expected out of me. So for instance, I never wear salwar kurtas. And that at that point it was mostly because of my poverty, because it was easier to just maintain, jeans and a couple of t-shirts and things like that. But to go to Govindpuri, when I would go, I bought 2 Fab India kurtas, and I would sort of not smoke in public, or even would find myself lying about it, and lying about a lot of very fundamental things, right? And which at the moment, which I was constantly aware that a lot of access I'm getting into these spaces is because of, it's not because of I was asking the most brilliant research questions or promising to, offer anything, but because of the sort of the intersections of my class, caste, and body situation that allowed those accesses. And I had a moment of crisis where I was like, I'm being so performative, I'm lying. So where does that sort of ethics of research ethics come in, where what is giving me the legitimacy and the right to reckon that I'm lying over there, but these people have to tell me the truth, which is also very central to the production of knowledge and how you're circulating it. And one of the things that was, we can come back to this later, but very briefly, like when I was like in this sort of moment, gripped in this moment of anxiety, I started looking at academic text, academic writings about people, both Indian, both foreigners, of different, embodying different bodies, different politics, their writings of working in these marginal spaces, to sort of get a sense of that they had to negotiate these anxiousness as well. And what I found most startling was the complete silence around these anxieties. It was almost as if the researcher in these spaces becomes a neutral body, and henceforth, like I very deliberately tried to negotiate these, but we'll come back to later. And I would like Cynthia to sort of comment on, because there is a range of bodies and the class, race we embody. So I think it would be interesting you to comment, and then we can go further.
Sure. For myself, I've been doing research for 8 years. So I'm very much an early researcher. I'm currently in the field. This is the field for me. So obviously I intersect and interact with these questions in a very different and visceral kind of way at this moment in time. And I think for me, the way I approached fieldwork, or my presence in the field, came in two strong axes. And one was my race privilege, my class privilege. Coming to my master's research was in Ghana, where I worked on water access and urban informal settlement. And now I work on electronic waste recovery here in Hyderabad. And so obviously I came here, I had read all the literature, I had done my methods courses, and it comes with anxiety about how you're going to interact. And you will know when you're there. And it's this gut reaction, and it comes to you, and you mess up sometime, but you learn. The other axis, though, one that's very different, is safety. You're a young woman, you're going to the field. What does that mean for you? And so currently I'm doing a PhD. My cohort at the University of Toronto, there's 14 of us, 11 men, 3 women, one of which is over 50, and so obviously she interacts with the field very differently. And I'm one of 2 students who does international field work. And as a younger researcher, I think it came for me with a lot of frustration. When I was in Ghana, I lived with a researcher who did research on police corruption. So he would ride all night long with police officers, and that was his field work. Obviously, a kind of research that's not accessible for me. And as a young researcher, I was very frustrated. I worked on water. At the University of British Columbia, we were called the Water Girls. In the department, you had water girls and war boys. And then the war boys, they worked in the Middle East. And then the water girls, obviously, we worked on water access, which the WASH system is full of women worldwide. And I was extremely frustrated until I took ownership of that, until I understood, instead of access, the question is access. My body grants me a certain access, and with that comes ethics. And so instead of being frustrated about the question I cannot ask, here I work with a translator. So much of it is lost, and I know it's right there. I know it's not getting translated. It's when the microphone is off. It's when we're getting on a scooter to go somewhere else and somebody makes a joke about who I'm going to ride with, because not everybody wants to take me on their scooter because I'm a white woman. Or they will tell me to walk outside of the settlement, then they'll pick me up. And all these things I can infer, but it's lost on me. And those moments I can't get people to translate for me oftentimes. I'm learning Hindi very slowly. But then at some point, there are questions I can't ask. There are questions that, because Gautam talked about it earlier this week as maybe deceptive naivete. And in my case, it's not always deceptive. This context is so foreign to me that it grants me this position when I can just ask about the obvious. And there are questions that are available for me. And in India particularly, people can't read caste on me and I can't read caste on them. And it makes that interaction sometimes very much easier than if I had a different body to walk with.
Yeah, yeah, no, I sort of that issue of the access which my body grants me, right? Like that I can ask questions, and but at some point during my interactions, sustaining interactions as in Govindpuri, where there was like what we were talking during the workshop, like last 2 days, that there was the fact that I did not give up on working in continuing engaging with Govindpuri and its residents also beyond the research praxis was also a political position I was taking. So I also had to say, like, there is a moment in that field work when the researcher becomes the research. So I also had to open myself up. I also had to say that, okay, I'm here to listen to you, but yes, it's going to be reciprocal. And what you said, there comes the ethics with the access you get. And I'm very, very aware about the privileges of my position. And that makes me really very conscious about what I'm saying. But because there is also a burden of listening. Because when people like now, I don't I don't record conversations. People confide in me. And I have to be very careful. I have to take that position about what to be said, where to be said, very, very strategically as a political intervention, right? Yeah.
No, that's exactly right. There's so many moments in which both of you are talking that resonate. And I want to pick up on kind of two things. One, again, is the what I mentioned at the beginning, the politics of knowledge production. Because again, as somebody who was trained in the sciences in India, right? Science is objective, neutral. You collect data and then you analyze data. Social sciences sort of takes from the same kind of model that you're going to go do research. Anybody's going to do the research and then there's going to be data that you analyze. I mean, female bodies see these issues, or these issues of fieldwork that all of us are talking about seem to be more evident in female bodies. But again, all bodies are gendered. So male bodies, again, who's going to have access to what kind of war? So the point that I want to get to is that it was navigating these different moments of fieldwork that I bumped again and again and again. Are we into 30 minutes? Is that what you're telling us? Okay, great. So that was very quick. I want to jump fast forward and say that it's what these moments of bodies in the field tells you is that knowledge production is always embodied, gendered, and race, right? So that's sort of the intervention into the politics of knowledge production that feminists have been making for a long time. That no kind of data is just data. It's never neutral, right? And ethics is going to take different moments. Again, as an Indian going to do research in India, in Colombia, participatory research was not trying to do the kind of stuff that Dr. Anita was talking about this morning, right? That's something kind of I fantasize about, but I have no organic community left anywhere if I ever had one. So for me, there was an immense curiosity for folks over there about India. So none of my interviews ever worked as interviews. They just didn't. Yeah. We just had conversations, and you just you went with the flow. You sat for 5 hours, however long it took for the conversation to go wherever it went. And so this whole notion of, again, data collection, interviews, just never worked for me. Recording conversations, I was telling Cynthia, every time, especially the first few years where I didn't understand the context very well, I would record a conversation. Somebody would start saying something really interesting. Somebody else would say, don't waste her tape. And it's like, oh my God, no, waste my take, because that's what I want to hear. So I stopped recording. Besides, I'm still very bad with technology, but things were coming out in conversation that did not necessarily come out in recording. But then it comes to the ethics of what are you going to use and how.
I just wanted to just briefly open up, because I just realized when you're talking about as an Indian doing research, I just want to sort of refer, so there was this one research project I was doing in Australia. So that sort of interesting flip of the research project was a hugely KPMG funded with the University of Melbourne, huge $1 million research project where we were going into middle class and upper middle class white households, basically essentially white households, about their everyday media consumption. And that I could completely see the sort of the whole politics of knowledge, the whole politics of the research, because there is this Indian person, a brown person, coming to do the research. And in that way, my body was appropriated to sort of, for them to maintain the balance, to say, oh, but you don't look Indian. You would not, your accent is not that, strong. So they were like, they had to close the distance to understand, accept me in the position of the researcher. So I just wanted to bring that up. Yeah.
That's very interesting. Should we open it up to reflection from the room? And
I want to open up the notion of the field, right? Not just to the field sites, but to these spaces and to other spaces in academia. So the precise kind of things of our bodies circulating. Our bodies don't stop. And when we enter into classrooms, when we enter into academia. So precisely the kind of things that Tripta is saying. Tripta is saying, sorry, I beg your pardon. No, thanks for correcting me. Play out even now, right? As who's going to ask you what makes you legitimate to go teach teach a particular subject? What's going to make you legitimate to speak in a particular kind of space? So I want to broaden the notion of field and work to other kinds of spaces. And again, at some point, perhaps, or just planted the idea that it's sort of a rough self-reflexive process for us at all times in these spaces, right? In which it's about power ones that we are under, but that we're exerting unconsciously at all times in the way I speak, in my accent, which changes, right? All of those things.
in some ways, the field is very much about posturing. Like, how are you in the field? So a month ago, I went home for my godson's christening, but also the AAA, the American Association of Anthropologists conference in the Bay Area. My cousin lives there, and I'm staying with her. And I get there, and all week long, I took Uber drives from her house to the conference center, and all of my drivers were Indian. The radio was always in Hindi, Muslim, Hindus, Sikh. And then one day, my driver was a young Punjabi driver. And then he told me about how the first 8 years of his life in the US, he drove long distance, long haul driving. And he said, Punjabis, we always drive. We all drive. And here I work with traders who send shipments up to UP, and all their drivers are Punjabis. And then it's in the US that I had the most insightful conversation about work relation and how that works. And so what is the field? Is it here? Is it there? So it's this posturing. If it's asking the question, and then so it's never circumscribed or bordered. All right, questions from you guys or reflections? Sure.
Yeah. Questions?
And can you say your name, please?
Yeah, Kabir. Yeah. So I had a question for Tripta. When you say that initially there was a conflict about posing as someone you were not while entering field, how was the initial response when you started to change that to be more yourself in order to expect their reality? I am curious about the initial response.
More questions?
So I have a question to actually. I'm Sneha. Last night I'm meeting a friend of mine who's been doing rural research in India. So for the last year, she's been living in a village in Madhya Pradesh and now in Telangana. And we've got into a huge debate about precisely this. As a woman, when you visit a particular village, how do you behave in order to gain access, or when you're conducting a survey? Particularly because her research was around sensitization on gender roles. So because the divide that came between our conversations and the debate that became very aggressive. You're performing something in the way you wear, what you wear, when you put a dupatta on your head in order to speak to them and talk to them about gender roles. Are you sort of participating in the same types of, patriarchal rituals that in a way they're all subject to? while trying to, what I'm trying to say is, at what point does research, when it is focused on interventions to make them aware of these practices, becomes subject to the same systems and institutions? So how do you, when I want to say, we talk about annihilating patriarchy, and this is something that maybe is a political goal, but it also comes into social science research as feminist questions. So I'm very curious as to what do you do? How do you make a choice? Because I never thought of entering research spaces. I can't do it. But when women do it, it's just, I'm very curious about how do you navigate your personal politics and your role as researchers, particularly around these concerns.
Hi, my name is Ayla. Kind of wanted to build on what Sneha was also asking, and I was just wondering, in terms of, I come from a social science institute which has taught me that you basically you use your identity in order to gain access. So you preferably work in an area that I've always preferred working in Telugu areas because I speak Telugu, and that has kind of continued and stayed with me. So I wanted to ask if you let your access that is based on your identity define what you research, and does that make it easy to research if your identity is perceived as someone who's trustable?
To answer Kabir and responding to, I'm sorry, I didn't, Sneha. So, like when I first started doing it, I read a lot of Foucault before going that, and I really took the whole idea of transgression very seriously, in the sense of that, my presences, what my presences are doing in transgressions in terms of, pushing the boundaries of conversation. So if I'm sat over there and this, Sneha, what you're saying that, what kind of performances. And so wherever field you go into, right, there are sites of feminist assertion within their local grammar and vocabularies. And what usually happens when researchers from a certain background go, they refuse to even acknowledge and engage with that. So there is enough patriarchally co-challenge, right? So if I'm sat over there and I'm smoking a cigarette and I'm saying ma behan ki galiya and all of those things, so I'm not inserting anything new. I facilitate a conversation, right? Or like for instance, I've covered different elections, and the seasoned researchers or activists would say, "Arey, don't talk politics with the people. You come from the left, don't challenge it." But if not I, who else, right? Like, let me push and I think I'll just finish this one with this one point, that my initial performance and posturing was coming with this very implicitly, very internalized idea that these people, quote unquote, these people will not be able to understand my reality. Like, in that sense, already sort of extending them a very paternalistic attitude no, they can't understand my reality, whereas I can. And the moment you can constantly shift that, open yourself to challenges, open yourself to questions, I guess it becomes more fluid. It's also dangerous. It's also dangerous in the sense that then you have put your ideas out there. You have to take that position, right? So,
yeah. I want to speak. What is your name? Sorry? Ayla. Your question is a very good question, and a question I ask myself every day as a white woman doing research in India. And asking your question every day is the answer. The day you find the answer, the day it's black and white, that's when you've lost touch with the critical reflection. So that question should always be with you. I have a lot of recognition for the work you're doing. I found that for me, I had to take myself out of my own context to develop that positionality, that now 10 years later, I could come back to my own backyard and look at it critically. I had to learn that craft somewhere else. Also, it's harder to look at your own mess in some ways. Canada's colonial history, There are questions I'm French Canadian, I'm Quebecois. So if I ask any political questions, obviously in Canada, I'm reading it through my own eyes or what I've been taught in school, my own history, etc., which are questions that I can do away with here because I don't have that burdened history with me in my body. I have a different one, but it allows me to ask different questions. I am starting new projects at home, and I'm interested in that reflection. What it means for me, what is the difference for me as a researcher, what kind of access, what kind of performativity, what is going to change. And I think researchers that do both work at home and elsewhere, there are too few of us, and I would really like to read a methods book on that.
We have time for one quick round of questions as well. So any other questions?
So I think the questions that we've been asked are really interesting, and thank you all for sharing your reflections. I'd just like to go back to this issue of how much of yourself and your feminist politics you put out there, and the relationship of that with listening. Right? Because for me, questions of consent to patriarchy, to class, to poverty are very important to understand as well. And I think that there is a tension here, which I find I'm constantly negotiating between hearing stories that you only get to hear after a certain degree of trust, which are in fact stories then of violence, of domestic violence, of aggression towards the elderly, of child abuse, very difficult conversations. So you get to a point where you only hear and are able to listen. So there is a conflict, I think, between listening and intervening and being, very sort of open to political positions that I have come to after considerable struggle and difficulty myself. So I think for me, there is always a tension between that, and I'd be interested in hearing from you.
Yeah, that's again a great question and a very complicated. To some extent, I always take me in the field. I mean, there's not, here's a different way of putting it. We're always performing, right? This is a performance. It's like we're always performing something. So when you're in the field, when I'm in the field, I'm performing something. I think over time, I learned to, what again, Dr. Anita was saying, empathetic listening. After a while, you kind of learn to sort of be quiet and listen a little bit more. And perhaps one of the most important things I actually learned from biological fieldwork, and this can sound a little odd, is when I was an ethologist, which is that I studied animal behavior, where you record things, you never interpret, you just keep recording and you just watch what's going on and not interpret it right away. It's extremely difficult to do, and the same thing, social reality. It's sort of, as Tripta was saying, people are disrupting things in their context. They've lived there for a long time. You see something the first time around or a second time around, it's going to look like something that you don't like or don't accept. But they negotiating their realities in a variety of different ways. So this question that Preeti is asking to think about is a very, very complicated one. And this is where long-term research or long-term fieldwork is, I think, extremely important of gaining trust. How does one intervene? What are the different ways in which you can do it? And again, it changes over time. What are you going to be able to do for somebody? As somebody who grew up in the age of participatory action research, what participatory action research was, again, talk about essentialization. I was read as somebody from India. There's a tuber that grows over there called papachina, which was getting diseases, and they wanted me to kind of figure out a way of, growing it so that it wouldn't die. And it's like, anybody who knows me is not going to let me near a plant, because if I go near a plant, it's just going to curl up and die. But okay, so what am I going to do? I'm read as somebody who's from Asia who knows how to deal with papachina. So in that moment, the intervention is to talk to an agronomist and bring the agronomist to a village. So there are ways in which you kind of intervene in small ways, and in the long term, maybe they'll do other things. I beg your pardon.
I just wanted to. Your question is intersecting with some reflections I've been having, and I apologize for these are very half-baked. But for me, the feminist politics question comes in how, as a woman, I am used to listening. I'm used to doing this emotional labor. And my translator here that I've been working with is always shaken by these stories that come from mostly women, but men and women, these stories of hardship, these stories of, he's not used to hearing those stories. Whereas I've heard these stories for women in my family, from my aunties, from my grandma, stories of navigating migration. And I think this is the kind of work that's expected of women. Obviously, there's the length of duration. You build that relationship over time, but it intersects with my body in other ways.
Yeah, just to sort of further what I was been saying. So I did my thesis was an ethnography of the everyday within the Juggis and the interactions with the neighboring middle classes, and it's actually called listening into others. And I talk about listening as a methodology, but when I first started, I was not listening because as a sophisticated, evolved methodology, but I had to practice humility in that space, to learn the codes, to learn not to sort of say, oh, if I don't recognize this as feminist assertion, then it is not. To be able to understand how these patriarchal communal caste negotiations happen, which and for me, in a space like the Juggis, for whatever the slums, even if it's a matter of compulsion, there is, whether compulsion, need, whatever, there is a very strong evolved practice of co-ethical cohabitation, right? That. And so we have to sort of talk about it in those terms, to sort of not have this thing about if they're not responding to a certain grammar, right? So yeah, Vanchika is waving.
Can I just say one more thing? I think to me, this is where my academic methodologies and my activist background intersect, because in activism I've learned about nonviolent communication, whereas if you already know what you're going to answer and the person is still talking, you're not listening. Yeah. And so if I come to the field with an interview script and I know my next question is about this, but the conversation is taking me elsewhere, and in academia we have a hard time because I have non-generalizable answers. I don't ask the same question of everyone because the conversation went elsewhere, and I think that's a reflection for academia.
Vanchika, I'm going to intervene for 1 second to point out to the issue of politics of policymaking, which I'm not going to be talking about, but precisely all of these things play out in the policy of, in the politics of policymaking. So when I go as a senior scientist to the Center for International Forestry Research, where all of these dynamics play out, in the notion of what is considered science, this kind of nuanced, non-generalizable answers are considered advocacy, are considered politics, and therefore not allowable, right? So when the red plus, or for those of you who don't know the lingo, reduction in emissions from deforestation and land degradation, the plus is to add the social elements. You say, well, you want to address the social elements. It's not the issue of adding things on, but to understand things from a different perspective. That is completely not allowable, right? And bodies like mine, speaking in those spaces, at some level, it's sort of the opposite. When something is going on, you intervene. It's my ethical imperative to intervene. It's not going to do anything. I have to do it with non-attachment. But I have to intervene. Is it going to be taken seriously? No, right? And before I enter, I'm read as a feminist. Before I enter, I'm read as a militant feminist. I didn't do anything. I hadn't even spoken yet, right? But before I enter, my body is already read even in those spaces. And so then that involves a different kind of negotiation. But it's always fun.